because it's exactly what it feels like when you've got extreme abdominal Crohn's pains. It's like, yeah, that's what it feels like. There's an alien trying to, and I've probably made that joke at times of like, I feel like there's an alien trying to burst out of my belly.
Welcome to Psychocinematic, a podcast where we analyse depictions of mental illness and disability in popular films and TV. I'm your host, Stephanie Fornasia. If you love our podcast and want to give us some support, make sure you're following Psychocinematic Podcast on Instagram, TikTok and Twitter. And check out our website, psychocinematicpodcast.com, for access to special bonus content, episodes, early access, stickers, and contribute to our regular fundraisers. Join our Patreon. Starting from $3.50 a month, you can be the coolest psychocinematic listener there is. I'd like to start today's episode by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present, and rising, and also just acknowledge that I'm currently sitting on stolen land. And I'd like to introduce my wonderful co-host today, Christopher Cosgrove. Welcome to Psychocinematic, Chris.
Hello, nice to be here.
Do you prefer Chris or Christopher? I should just check that.
I always say Christopher when I'm in trouble, and Chris the rest of the time.
Yeah, that's a bit like Steph and Stephanie for me.
Yeah.
So Chris completed your Bachelor of Fine Arts in Film at QUT and then began your screen career in Meanjin or Brisbane, which is the land that you're on today, I assume?
Yes.
Yes, lovely. Editing TV commercials and corporates. In 2018, he moved to Sydney to study directing at the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, or AFTRS. It was there where he wrote and directed Boldly Go, an autobiographical short film about the challenges of dating with a colostomy bag. The film's comedic and heartwarming tone proved to be a hit with audiences across the globe, garnering official selections at over 20 international film festivals, including BFI Flare, the London Queer Film Festival, Real Abilities New York, Leeds International Film Festival, and Inside Out, the Toronto Queer Film Festival. The film also received a market screening at the 72nd Festival de Cannes. Is that right?
Yeah, it's French. Festival de Cannes, let's go with
Festival
that.
de Cannes. Short Film Corner, and is streaming on ABC Iview. Chris currently works part-time as a digital content producer for a disability services provider whilst continuing to develop his own creative screen projects. So it's such an honour to have you on the podcast today, Chris, especially because we're talking about lots of depictions of mental illness and disability, and it's a real treat to be able to talk to someone who has created an actual depiction of a mental illness or disability. So thank you so much for joining us.
No worries. Pleasure to be here.
Just to start with, tell me a little bit about your experience in the film world and what made you decide to study film.
I think I grew up in a family where we were all big sort of film fanatics. So I always appreciated like watching films. I was always really artistic, and so in like school, we didn't have a film program at my school, so I did a lot of like visual art and drama, and I loved English and writing, and so it wasn't until I got to the end of grade 12 when I was trying to decide what to do for university that someone even suggested perhaps you should consider doing film. And at that point, I kind of wasn't prepared to make that jump, and so I was academically, I performed quite well, and so I had these sort of expectations of like, well, that's not a real job, I can't do an arts job. So I diligently enrolled myself in a Bachelor of Business in that'll have a bit of creativity in it. And after 2 years of that, I think my soul was completely pulverized, and that was then I had a tutor, a fantastic tutor. I remember in that last semester who his day job was a copywriter for commercials, and he had basically seen some of the stuff I'd written and was like, Chris, what are you doing here? You should be in film school. And it was, I think, the first moment I kind of had a real sort of career counselling from someone in the industry. So I took that definitely on board. And so that's when I applied then for the Bachelor of Fine Arts, not really thinking I'd get in because I didn't have any film. So I remember coming to the interview. At that point, they used to have an interview process, and I just like brought like this crazy person with a trolley full of like all my artwork that I just like all of my things I had made, sculptures and paintings, and then like excerpts of drawings. I was like, look, I promise I'm really creative. I just haven't made film before, and managed to get in, which was great. And then
fantastic.
From there, I just kind of fell more and more in love with it.
Yeah, oh, brilliant. I'm glad that you made that transition because clearly you've got real like natural talent in that area. I guess today I asked you to come on the podcast because I thought you'd be perfect to talk about a chronic illness that I've wanted to capture on the podcast for a while, which is inflammatory bowel disease or Crohn's. So really appreciate you willing to share a bit about that and how you've captured that through Boldly Go. I guess to start with, I might just run through what IBD is, and please feel free to correct me if I get anything wrong. I'm mostly taking this from the internet. But inflammatory bowel disease is a term for two conditions, which is Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, that are characterized by chronic inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract. Prolonged inflammation results in damage to the GI tract or gastrointestinal tract. And I thought it'd be good to clarify the difference between IBD or inflammatory bowel disease and IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, which is also quite common. And there is a very big difference in the two, although they can sort of share similar symptoms. Irritable bowel syndrome is more classified as a functional gastrointestinal disorder, which means there's some type of disturbance in bowel function, which is suggested to be caused by disturbance between the brain and gut, which is often why psychological counselling is given as a treatment. There's usually no actual inflammation or damage, and it rarely requires hospitalisation or surgery. And there's no sort of way to actually diagnose it because you can't actually see it on imaging. Whereas IBD is much more severe in its impact. You can see it in a screener and can cause some real significant damage to the colon. So if anyone's hearing these two sort of descriptions of symptoms, that's something to keep in mind if you're suspected that you've got one of these things. Did I get that right from your understanding, Chris?
Yeah, I think so. One thing I think that's kind of important to sort of mention is that it's very much like a Western medicine classification system more around treatment.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes people, I've heard friends who have IBS, it can be really debilitating, and the condition can be just as bad sometimes as friends that have Crohn's. And yet there's this sort of, sometimes thought that's like, oh, that's not as bad because that's IBS, that's not IBD.
That's a good point to make, yeah.
It's more sort of just like a clinical definition around what's causing the illness, I suppose.
Yeah.
Not necessarily how severe your symptoms or how valid your pain might be.
Thank you for saying that too, because I feel like, particularly with anything with the word functional in front of it, there's a lot of misinformation or some judgment from people that, it's not as legitimate as other chronic illnesses or conditions, but it is absolutely legitimate. Yeah, there's obviously different indications for why those disorders or syndromes occur, and that's why one is classified as a disease and one is classified as a syndrome. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Do you mind sharing a little bit about your own experience with Crohn's disease?
Yeah, sure.
So when did you first notice sort of symptoms of Crohn's?
So I think it was around 2007. I would have been about 21. I'd probably, in hindsight, had symptoms before then and not necessarily kind of paid too much attention to them. But certainly it came to a head around that point in my life. What had started to happen was I'd probably always had a bit of what some people call, an upset tummy. I'd had pyloric stenosis as a baby, which is sort of when you're born with the bottom of your stomach is kind of constricted and you need a little surgery to open it up. And so I always had a lot of reflux and often easily get sick as a kid. But at that point when I was around 21, what kind of drew my attention to it was I was starting to go to the toilet and I was losing a lot of blood when I was going to the toilet. So I was when I was doing a poo, basically.
Yeah.
And at first I think I was just oh, that's weird. I don't want to have to think about that right now. And probably being, a young male, might have fallen into a stereotype there of that'll probably just go away by itself. But it didn't. And it proceeded to kind of get worse. And then I remember one night I went to loo and it was really bad. And it was just this is a scene from The Shining or something. This is terrifying. And so that was where I think I was really scared and had to tell mum and dad, and then we went to the hospital that night to emergency, and that then sort of triggered then a chain of diagnostics, which ended up doing my first colonoscopy would have been that week. And from that colonoscopy they could see straight away that I had quite severe ulceration in my large intestine.
That would have been so terrifying to go through that process.
Yeah, it was. It was really scary, particularly because I hadn't heard about Crohn's before. I guess, you don't know much about a colonoscopy when you're that age. It's not something people normally do at that age. Thankfully, I had an amazing, just by luck, an amazing gastroenterologist that was my first connection. And so she was the one who did the colonoscopy. She was quite young, which was rare. I think it was the fact that it was a female doctor, a young female doctor. I really connected with her.
Mm.
And she was really human, and I think was good at working with young patients, and
Yeah.
could acknowledge that, number one, there was just a scared person in front of you before
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
medical stuff, and was really good at dealing with that. I remember her saying when I woke up from the colonoscopy, I was like, okay, look, this is what we're seeing. It could just be a one-off, but we need to do some blood tests which will confirm it. But she said, look, I'd better Freddo frog that it's probably Crohn's disease. And I remember just thinking, like, that's an unusual thing for a doctor to say. She had a great sense of humor, and so
Mm.
that straight away gave me a little bit of consolation and trust, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like she was pretty amazing, and I think sadly we don't always have medical professions that really get it and how to talk with particularly young scared people, so it's really valuable when there is one that really just helps you in that
Yeah.
experience.
Shout out Dr. Lisa Barrett. You're amazing.
Amazing. So what sort of transpired after that point? It sounds like that was obviously, I don't want to out your age, but a while ago.
Yeah. So that then kind of began, I guess, the beginning of my sort of Crohn's journey. It would have been, I'm trying to remember now, I think about a year. Within that first year, probably would have been basically when you're diagnosed with Crohn's, one of the first things they tend to do is they just hit you really hard with steroids to try
Mhm.
and get the inflammation down. So once
Yeah.
they'd done the blood test to confirm that it was Crohn's, because they could see my white cell markers were really high, which means you've got like active inflammation in your body.
Mhm.
The first thing they just want to do is just try and get the inflammation under control. And so it's really common to even today still do a lot of steroid treatment, even though a lot of those drugs kind of are very old, and they're
Mhm.
kind of, like trying to hit a needle with a sledgehammer.
Mm.
They do a lot of other impacts to your body at the same time. So
Yeah.
I remember, and she did warn me, but you gain a lot of weight, it makes your face puff up,
Mhm.
and you go really red in the face. You get really hyperactive, so sort of sleep was all over the shop, quite manic on those large doses.
Mm.
So
Mm.
that in itself was a whole sort of crazy experience, of just doing the prednisone. I remember that first year.
Yeah.
Once they get the inflammation under control, usually the next thing that the doctors want to try and do is then put you into remission or keep you in remission. So remission is this term they use for Crohn's, which is basically the disease itself can come and go throughout your lifetime. And there'll be periods when it's really active and you have what they call like flare-ups, and then you'll have periods where it's inactive and you can kind of live a normal life.
Mhm.
So the goal is always trying to keep it inactive. And so the immunosuppressant drugs is to try and maintain that or
Mhm.
extend the period of remission between flare ups. Those drugs also have their own sort of side effects.
Mhm.
So they're, the ones I was on, they're sort of mildly cytotoxic. They can have, for some people, like my younger brother was diagnosed with Crohn's the year after me. He wasn't able to tolerate that first sort of dose until they found an alternative, because for a lot of people, it can have issues with your liver function.
Mhm.
So there's complications even just with the treatment where they're trying to sort of find the right
Yeah.
medication. So you can go on a journey while, we test different medications on you to find which one works. I've fortunately always been pretty lucky with the meds that I've had, where I haven't had major side effects or major contraindications with my medications, but that can also add extra complications to people's Crohn's
Yeah,
journey.
definitely. Mm.
Once I'd had the immunosuppressants, but that would have been within that first 2 years, the condition had still sort of not really got much better, and I was
Mhm.
quite sick. And basically, what had started to happen without me realizing was I was having really frequent bowel obstructions. I just thought at the
Mm.
time, as like, I've got really bad gastro, I'm vomiting every weekend. But
Yeah.
that went on for like about 6 weeks, and then I remember I was just in like a new share house, and I was sort of on my own at the time because the other housemates were out, and just having probably what people describe when they have like appendicitis, like a burst appendix. It was just like
Yeah.
extreme abdominal pain, like as in
Excruciating. Yeah.
fell out of the bed, couldn't move, got the phone, called an ambulance, and then got admitted into hospital. And whether it happened at that point or it then proceeded to happen over the next night, but essentially what proceeded to happen was my intestine had burst.
Oh
So I
God.
had a perforated intestine.
Mm.
So I had to have an emergency, what's called an ileectomy, which is where they remove the ileum, which is just a part of your intestine, basically. It's the bit between the small intestine and the large intestine. So that had to be cut out. But because it had already perforated, I'd had peritonitis, which is like where you get sepsis, where basically because, stuff that's going through your intestine tract shouldn't be mixing in with your blood, and so
Yep.
you get crazy infection.
Yep.
And so I remember going into the procedure thinking, like, at that point they'd said, oh, hopefully it's this keyhole, you'll be awake in a few hours. And then I woke up the next day in ICU and had a colostomy bag.
Mm.
And at that point, no one had mentioned anything about colostomy bags, like a zero discussion until that moment. And that was definitely extremely disorienting.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so that was sort of the first time I'd had an ostomy. And then they were able to reverse it sort of 3 months later, which is
Okay.
common when you've had some bowel procedures. People don't necessarily know that about ostomies. They can sometimes be removed, so they can connect the bowel back up together again once it's had time to heal. That was sort of the story of my first ostomy bag, I guess. And then I've since had to have one further on for longer periods. I've had multiple bowel resections over the course of the last sort of 15 years.
Mm-hmm. So it's been a very well, it is a lifelong condition, but also continuous ups and downs and pretty significant surgeries in that time.
Yeah,
Mm.
definitely. And I guess to point out to you, like, if you are listening and maybe you've just been diagnosed with Crohn's, I'm definitely on the more like extreme end of the scale in terms of surgical intervention. So when I mentioned my younger brother, he was diagnosed with Crohn's the year after me. He's had no surgeries, so
Mhm.
he still, can experience quite a lot of pain and discomfort. And there's times when he's, unable to work, but it doesn't necessarily mean. I think the stat is 80% of people with Crohn's need to have at least one surgery in their lifetime. But in my situation, I've had quite extensive surgeries, but that's probably not a stereotypical case study. So
Mhm.
don't necessarily freak out if you're listening to this. Yeah.
But I guess from what I'm reading as well, there's quite a spectrum of how Crohn's can affect an individual, and quite a range of different symptoms that people can experience. So just because you're diagnosed with Crohn's doesn't mean it's going to be this medication and this is what's going to happen and this is how you're going to experience. I guess just like any illness in a way.
Yeah, that's right. And Crohn's is also a bit unique compared to ulcerative colitis, where Crohn's can affect anywhere in the digestive tract. So whilst it's most commonly the intestines and the bowel, it can actually be anywhere from your mouth to your bottom. You can have issues with Crohn's
Mm.
disease. And
Mm.
so some people will have Crohn's symptoms completely separate to stuff to do with their bowel.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask what it was like, especially that first 3 months period when you didn't expect it, having an ostomy bag for that duration of time?
Yeah, it was definitely a wild ride. It was a couple of things. One, just physically, I guess because it was an emergency operation, it meant I'd had like a very large incision running the whole way down my abdomen,
Mm.
don't know how many staples.
Wow.
And so those first 3 months, that was all still healing as well. So even
Yeah.
just mobility and walking around and things. But I was young, and so I was probably still trying to do a lot of things naively that I probably shouldn't have been doing. So I remember, it would have been the week after I got out of hospital. I was in hospital for about 2 or 3 weeks, and I'd got back into my uni share house, and it was about day 3. My other housemate's like, "Hey, we're just going around the corner to like a house party, and do you want to come?" And I was like, "Sure." And if anyone knows Brisbane, Meanjin, it's very hilly, and we were in
Yeah.
Kelvin Grove,
Don't miss that.
and just round the corner actually involves 3 or 4 very steep declines, and so I remember getting to this party and. Could barely breathe just from like the exertion of it. And then going to the party and being about an hour in and then realizing, oh, what's that smell? And I thought I had stepped in something, and then went to the toilet and realized that the bag had started leaking. And
Oh
that
no.
was, I guess, the first time I'd encountered that,
Mm.
because I was still very new to the whole journey, and things like sweat can affect adhesives.
Mm.
There's a lot of tricks that you learn along the way to manage things, and certainly I guess those first 3 months would have been a big journey of just discovery and learning how to manage day-to-day life.
Mm. Mm.
A lot of people normally, if you were having an ostomy, in most circumstances there would be some sort of preparation time where you might get some counseling or therapy training before the procedure, where you probably learn some of that stuff.
Yeah.
But in my case, that kind of didn't really happen, so sort of learning on the fly as
Mm.
we went along.
Were you offered that after the procedure as you were
I
recovering?
was. There were stoma nurses at the hospital who I remember on day one of me waking up were very animated coming into the room, very enthusiastic to teach me all these things. But at that point, I was just like so full of fentanyl that
Yeah.
the room was spinning most of the time, and I remember
Yeah.
it was actually too much. I just wanted them to leave the room. I couldn't actually look at the bag for about 3 or 4 days that
Mm.
the nurses would come and do the change. And I actually was at that point, I just can't even process this yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it would have been about day 3 when I was prepared to actually look down and see what had happened. And then it probably would have been about the first a week or so after that when I was prepared to be involved even with the changing, seeing what's called the stoma for the first time. So stoma is like the little part of intestine that comes out of your abdomen when they make an ostomy.
Mhm.
Uh, and even that, if you've never seen anything like that before, is quite terrifying. It's like, it literally looks like I've got some of my guts hanging out of me.
Mm.
This
Mm.
can't be okay. How are we all so cool about this? So learning to normalize that, and that you are safe. This is okay. This is may not seem normal, but is in fact normal. A lot of
Mm.
people have these. It's a daily, procedure that happens
Yeah.
in most hospitals.
Mm.
But it's certainly the person going through it. It seems anything but that at the
Yeah,
time.
100%. That would have just been such a difficult thing to process, and it makes sense that it took you a few days just to like come to terms with what you've got. And then you had another ostomy bag for quite a
Mm,
long period of time.
mm.
How was that experience for you?
So after that first one was reversed, I think it was about 3 or 4 years before I needed to have another bowel resection. The resection was because a combination of things. The Crohn's was flaring up, and so there was inflammation in the bowel from the Crohn's. But there was also scarring from the previous surgery, which is also quite common when you have bowel procedures or anything with your abdomen. You can get what's called adhesions,
Mm.
where parts of the bowel kind of stick to other parts or stick to the abdominal wall. And so, because of those adhesions and that scarring, what was starting to happen was, again, I would be eating things and then I would be really nauseous and then vomiting, or getting intense abdominal pain.
Mm.
And it was quite inconsistent, which was also really frustrating. It would depend. I had to kind of go through a whole process of learning what it was I could eat and what I couldn't eat. And it came down to consistency.
Mm.
Is it something that was fine enough to be able to go through, considering how narrow the bowel had become at that point?
Mhm.
And when it got to the point when I was very limited in things I could eat, that was when the surgeon was sort of like, okay, you're too young to just be on slop, essentially.
Yeah.
We need another resection. And when they did that resection at the time, it was a combination of things. They put the bag back on, but that was also the reason why that time it was there for 3 years was I had also simultaneously started developing Crohn's in a different part of my body. This bit's kind of icky. You can tune out if you gross out.
Okay. Content warning for anyone who doesn't like
Content
icky
warning.
things.
Yeah, but it's something people don't really talk about with Crohn's, and
Mm.
I think it is pretty common with Crohn's. They're called fistulas, which is where the body gets confused and it starts creating little tunnels between. Sometimes you get it between parts of your bowel, but most commonly you can get them around your bottom,
Mm.
and so you can get essentially like pockets of infection, which become incredibly painful. Like I couldn't walk for a couple of months because of when it was particularly bad, and the way they have to treat that is they put sort of like it's kind of like explaining like a twist tie, like a cable tie. Like they put like little plastic cables around your bottom to keep these little tunnels open so that they don't get infected. But in my case, it kind of they'd done that once and they had a second one. I think they got up to 3 and it wasn't settling down. So that was actually the primary reason why they
Mm.
decided to put the bag on permanently, well, for 3 years,
Mm.
because it completely, they call it like a deviating ileostomy, something like that, where
Okay.
essentially it's to be able to shut down the whole lower part of your digestive tract so it can just heal and
Yeah.
recover and you're not having to go to the toilet every day.
Mm.
And so that was why then that bag stayed as long as it did, to let the lower end sort of properly heal, which it did, thankfully.
Great.
And that's kind of come and gone over the years, but the bag was sort of the only way to really let things properly cover.
Yeah.
Some people, when that gets particularly complex, which was on the cards for me. They weren't really sure at the time until they did the procedure. Sometimes you can have what is affectionately called online as a Barbie butt, where they'll completely close off the end of your colon permanently. And so if you imagine what a Barbie butt looks like, they kind of do something like that to
Or
you.
a Ken butt?
Or a Ken butt, a Barbie or a Ken butt, yeah. And then you'll permanently have the ostomy bag from that point. They can't reverse that if they have to make that procedure. Thankfully, that didn't have to happen to me at the time, but whether or not in the future that might be something I have to look at, we'll see.
Yeah. It sounds like, and I think you've written this in the notes, like Crohn's is almost like a full-time job in a way of having to manage it and go through quite significant surgeries, also being conscious of things that you eat, etc. How has it impacted your life, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, mentally, I've learned to sort of treat it like a part-time job. And when I say that, it's more to do with, I guess, psychologically allowing myself to sort of prioritize the condition and give it the time that is required to keep myself healthy. If I try and do like the 30 Rock Liz Lemon, I can do it all usually. And I'll have periods in my life when I get particularly excited and I think, you know what, I can do it all. Usually that means I'm heading for a spectacular crash medically. So I've learnt that I need to kind of think about it like my part-time job, and then I have my real part-time job and whatever else in my life, but I need to allocate the time to just the maintenance, which a lot of the times means actually just rest. That I've Crohn's, for me, if I can rest, it keeps the symptoms under control, and so allocating that time in my week and giving myself, I guess, permission to do that, which is another thing sort of psychologically.
Yeah, not everyone feels they can do that, so that's really important. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, and I struggle with it. I gotta say, like, it's not something. It's something. I just use the phrase part-time job because I find for me that helps me kind of click and go, yeah, okay, you're not going out tonight, or you're not doing that meeting. You've got your other job, remember, you've got to go to, which is lying in bed for the next 12 hours because you have to do that. Yeah.
And that does sort of differentiate us from, I think there's also a misunderstanding for people who are not part of the chronic illness community that people who are chronically ill and have to rest are actually having a great time resting, and it's like nice and fun, when it's actually absolutely not.
Usually that's what you don't want to be doing. You're actually sacrificing something that you want to be doing to go and do that. Yeah, instead.
I was reading as well that it's not really about diet, but sometimes diet changes are a big part of that management. How has that affected your sort of diet as well?
Yeah, so diet with Crohn's specifically, because it's an autoimmune condition, I think that's one of the big misconceptions that I get asked a lot when you say you've got Crohn's, like, oh, so like, what's that? What are you allergic to, or what can't you eat? Because people think it's something like celiac or like an allergy, but it's because it's autoimmune, it's actually not triggered particularly by a food. It's not caused by a food, but foods can aggravate the symptoms. So really common ones for Crohn's, like usually the first thing they'll say is, if you are a smoker, can you do everything you can to stop smoking? Because they know that smoking really aggravates the condition. Alcohol and coffee can also aggravate, but there's also, I mean, different people, different food groups. For me, certainly I know that alcohol, I can kind of have one or two, but not like perhaps when I was 18 and we go out dancing and drinking, and I would still do it at that age even though I had Crohn's, but it was not good for me, and learning that actually it's not worth that pain. Don't do it to yourself. For me, I have diet restrictions now, but again, it's sort of back to do with the bowel narrowing and stricturing. So I've had 4 bowel resections, and they've kind of got shorter in intervals. So there was it was like 4 years apart, then it was 3 years apart, and then the last one was 2 years apart. So when we get onto the film, basically I made the film sort of 6 months after I'd had the bag come off, and they did a resection then. And then it was only the year after the film, so 2019, I needed another one. And I was aware that they were getting more complicated, the procedures. I think the last 2, I remember the surgeon saying afterwards, I don't want to do that again. And there was sort of some complications with the last surgery where I'd lost a lot of blood during the procedure, and I just felt especially weak and drained after the last one. And perhaps it was just psychologically knowing that it had only come 2 years from the one before. And I always kind of feel like it takes about a year for me to kind of get back on track after having that disruption in life. And so when after sort of a year after this last one, I started having these same symptoms again of sort of bowel obstructions, I just didn't want to jump back on the same bandwagon. I felt like I've lived with this condition long enough now, after like 15 years, that I am knowing my body pretty well, and I've, knowing how to look after myself. And so I spoke with my gastroenterologist and my surgeon and said, look, is there an alternative to just having another procedure? And there was, but it just was very sort of unconventional, which was basically they can give me like liquid nutrition, but usually that's reserved for quite elderly people who have other reasons why they can't swallow. But the product does exist, and you can live off that and get your nutrition. Just lifestyle wise, most people choose not to do that.
Yeah.
And for me, I thought, well, I would actually rather have the consistency and the regularity in my life. That's what I felt like I was missing.
Yeah.
That I've just spent most of my 20s and 30s in a very unpredictable sort of lifestyle.
Yeah.
So many times I've had to cancel a holiday at the last minute, or, had even just the next day, I had an important work thing on, and then I've had dinner and then been throwing up all night and I can't go to work the next day.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted a period of stability. And so I decided I would give it a go. So I've now done that for the last 2 years, where I've been living on the essential nutrition. So it's like these 6 poppers a day that I have, and I can still have things that are liquid and dissolvable. So I still get to have ice cream, which is great,
Nice.
and custard, and a lot of like sugary things because they dissolve, not so much savory things. And we've kind of just got a plan with my doctors where it's like, look, we'll just reassess every year. And, if you're maintaining your weight, your inflammation markers aren't going up, you're not having bowel obstructions, then, basically the ball's in my court. If I get sick of it, then I can always go and have another procedure.
Yeah, true. So how is it going so far? Has it been successful for that 2 years?
It's, in terms of not having bowel obstructions, absolutely successful. So
awesome.
That's been fantastic. The bigger journey, I guess, is like a psychological one.
Yeah, for sure.
But I guess, when we talk about, superpowers that sometimes you can develop as a side effect of having health conditions or disabilities, I have learnt a lot about how adaptable I am in terms of, I guess, we talk about neuroplasticity, that I've learnt some of those skills where I can know that, look, this is hard now, but it's just a habit change, and it's a thought process change, and being aware of that, I guess. And I've been able to have some great therapists help me, and so working through mentally the steps. I know that my body's okay, I'm not going to be vomiting, but psychologically it's like, okay, this is really weird. You've been eating for, let's give away the age, 36 years, 37 years, and now you're not eating. Of course that's going to feel really weird, and you're going to have days where you're going to feel pretty depressed about that.
Especially when so much of life is about food, and there's food festivals, and going out and socializing is always around food and family, and so that must be a huge adjustment to make.
Yeah, and that is a whole separate thing, and I feel like that was an issue before I'd even decided to go on liquid nutrition.
True.
You're really spot on there, that because so much of social activity is based around food, that a lot of people, I think, that I know that have Crohn's or gastrointestinal issues, that can become quite stressful, just the thought of even like going to a social gathering because we're going to be eating, because you're always worrying like, well, what if they serve this, or what if I can't have that, or what if I get asked about X, Y, Z, particularly if that is something that is, has been quite traumatic for you. It's this process of like, okay, we have to revisit this trauma every time we sit down for a group meal. And sometimes you just don't have the energy to do that, or you don't necessarily want to do that.
For sure.
And so, in my circumstance, I've learnt with the essential nutrition, it's great for morning tea or afternoon tea. So if someone says, let's catch up for lunch, I'll be like, how about we catch up for morning tea instead? Because, I can sit there and drink a coffee or drink a tea and still be engaging in the same situation as everyone else, as opposed to feeling like I'm being excluded or doing something different.
Yeah, and I guess that's hard for other people to adjust to too, like having family dinners and stuff where you won't be eating with everybody else, and which should be completely fine and accepted, but I'm sure you get lots of questions just having that inconspicuousness.
It's the formal dinners that feel the weirdest, I must
Yeah.
say. Like, I just had a wedding a couple of weekends ago, and that they are weird when everyone's there and laying out the formal dinners, and then you've got your little papa there. Like, I always feel like I'm a little 6-year-old with my little juice popper. Sometimes I'll pour it into a glass just to feel fancy, But generally, people, if you can explain it to them, you get really good at learning shorthand ways of explaining something that hopefully doesn't prompt too many follow-up questions. But it's
Yeah.
part and parcel of living with the condition. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like that you've come through a lot of, like you're saying, using therapeutic and psychology, being able to accept that part of the journey in a way that hasn't stopped you from doing what you want to do.
Yeah, I try. Yeah, it's not always easy, and there are times when I fail, but I try. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing all of that, because I think it's such a stigmatized condition. It's so rarely talked about, particularly when things come to poo. People don't like to talk about poo.
Yeah.
When we all poo. So,
Yes.
we all have a gastrointestinal system. So, thank you so much for sharing and being quite open about it as well.
No worries.
Actually, one question.
Mm.
Did you feel comfortable talking about Crohn's from when you were first diagnosed, or was that a bit of a journey as well?
Oh, absolutely a journey. Yeah. It was really scary, definitely, at the start, because I didn't know anyone with Crohn's. I don't think I'd actually heard of the word Crohn's before I was diagnosed. So you kind of have to learn about it yourself first before you get to the point where you're comfortable answering questions or talking about it. So yeah, it's definitely a journey in and of itself. And perhaps a segue into the film, but for me, I was doing 2 journeys at the same time that I was diagnosed with Crohn's. It was only sort of 6 months after I'd came out to my friends and family, which I'm sure, the stress of that period of my life probably didn't help the condition,
Yeah.
aggravated it. But it did mean that first couple of years where I was sort of learning about Crohn's and learning how to talk about Crohn's, I was also doing this simultaneous journey of sort of learning about my sexuality and how to talk about my sexuality. And there were a lot of very uncanny similarities of this whole like sort of coming out process of like having to tell people things about yourself that perhaps you don't really want to right now, or it's the right thing to do, but you're not really feeling terribly comfortable about talking about it just yet.
And invasive questions perhaps as a result of sharing that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing with me your story and to the audience. And yes, that is a great segue into Boldly Go, which is the film that you made, which everyone can watch on ABC Iview right now, which is amazing. And I think it was published on them like 3 years ago.
Yeah, it was a pre-COVID baby.
Yeah.
I was meant to fly to London for the Queer Film Festival the week before the border shut. So I remember, cancelling the flights. It came out just as all that was sort of kicking off. Yeah.
Which is so unfortunate, but I'm glad it slipped through, at least for audiences to see online. I absolutely love it. I remember watching it when I think you were sharing it online that you'd created it, and just thinking it was so well made and amazing. And I can just see, hopefully this is a compliment to you, not anything else, but it reminds me of some of those amazingly raw and funny stories like Please Like Me and also Heartstopper as well, which I'm watching at the moment. But just really beautiful, and the acting was really good.
I love Please Like Me, so that was
good.
That's an honor. I think that's what I was aspiring for. Yeah.
Fantastic. So how did it start out? Like you sort of shared a little bit about your own journey and why that might have inspired it. Tell me a bit more about how it started out as a concept.
I had been teaching in Brisbane, teaching video editing sort of as my day job. And I'd always wanted to get into directing, and basically health had taken over most of my 20s. And then I had this little window when the bag came off in 2017 after I'd had it for 3 years, and having had that fresh resection, sort of I got a new lease on life where suddenly I could eat things again, and I was putting on weight and generally just feeling better. And so I decided, well, look, now's the best time because it's probably only going to start to get worse again physically. So now's the best time to do what you've always wanted to do. I've always wanted to go to, there's like the National Film School in Sydney, the Australian Film, Television, Radio School.
Mm.
And so I applied to do, at that point, they had a 1-year directing grad certificate that was part-time. It had to be part-time, that was whatever I was going to do.
Yeah.
And part of the application process, I'm pretty sure you had to write a sort of a 3 or 4 page script. And so that was, I think, when I wrote the very first draft for the film. I thought that was a story that I thought would be pretty unique and one that I thought had my best shot of getting in. So it was probably a little bit manipulative in a way initially, whereas I'm just going to give them the raw trauma and hopefully that
They
the
can't say
artistic
no to
panel,
that.
the artistic panel will love it. And turned out it worked. So that was kind of how it began, I guess, getting into film school to do this 1-year course. And then the main assessment, sort of the capstone piece for the year, was we would make a 5-minute short film that had to have 2 actors in one room. And I think that was it, and no dialogue. 1 scene, 2 actors, 5 minutes kind of thing was the restrictions.
Yep.
And so that was probably then when the script kind of evolved into what it is now.
I think you did such an amazing job too, like knowing that those were your restrictions. Because, like, if I was in film school, I'd be like, how do I make that engaging? But you really built a world around the film, so like you could tell that they had just come in, they were at a party in one of the main characters' bedrooms, which is, there's just so many layers to it, and like, he's a sci-fi nerd, and there's some questions around being comfortable with your sexuality as well as the Crohn's representation too, and one of the characters having a bag. And in 5 minutes, so much is conveyed in such a natural way too. So I just think you smashed it. Not that I'm, person who decides, but, I just think it was so brilliant.
Should I give the listeners a little synopsis of?
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm sort of going in assuming people have already watched it, but yes, give us a synopsis.
If you haven't watched it, yes, basically it's these 2 sort of early 20s guys. It's clearly they're coming into a bedroom. There's a party going on outside, and they've been drinking, and there's sort of a flirtatious behavior between them. And you're trying to figure out what's the relationship here. Clearly they have a bit of backstory, but you get the sense this is sort of first kiss territory, and that's sort of what proceeds to happen. But then one of them is then very uncomfortable suddenly and wants the other one to leave the room, and that sort of sparks a bit of conflict, which, at first the person who's being rejected think it's because they're not comfortable with their sexuality. It's a bit of a red herring. But then the other person sort of admits that no, it's actually because they've had a surgery and they have an ostomy bag and they haven't, had sex since they've had it, and they're feeling sort of self-conscious, which then ultimately leads to this moment of sort of acceptance from both of them, where the person who doesn't have the bag is sort of going, well, at the end of the day, I just like you, so I want to be with you. And the character who has the bag is sort of going on this transition of, okay, I'm going to be really open about this thing that I'm really nervous and scared about and feeling some shame about, perhaps, and then being embraced regardless. In a very tight 5 minutes.
It's so beautiful. Very, very tight, beautiful 5 minutes. And yeah, thank you for sharing that, because hopefully that explains to the listeners why it's such a journey in such a short amount of time. I guess one question I had to, because I did read some of the reviews of it as well, which were very positive, that there's like a sort of undercurrent story of shame and how that's a common experience for people with ostomies and also members of the LGBTQIA plus community. How did you want to sort of, what did you want to say about that sort of aspect of it through this film?
I guess that was sort of the heart of the film. The theme that I sort of set out trying to hopefully achieve was looking at how you overcome shame internally. Like if you're someone who's living that, what is necessary to actually get beyond that position? And I guess from my own personal journey, it was learning to completely let go and be prepared to be completely honest, completely accepting of your circumstances, the good, the bad, the ugly, and then allowing yourself to be vulnerable with the people that you care about or that you want to have healthy relationships with. And so, unless you can come to the table being honest and open, you've got to make that first step, and then hopefully the other person's going to meet you. You can't control what the other person's going to do, but if you can't make that first step, then of course nothing's going to go anywhere. So I guess that was the journey, the emotional journey that I was wanting to show, that transition of, I'm really nervous about this, I'm really scared about this, I'm uncomfortable about this thing about myself, to, okay, well, I'm just going to trust you, and I'm going to tell you exactly how I feel, raw, unfiltered, and hope that the other person kind of catches you. And I also really wanted to make a positive one, because there's a lot of queer films especially that tell that story, but they don't end well. They always show the negative flip, where and that happens in life. But personally, I'd seen a lot of those stories, I'd seen a lot of those films, and I just didn't always find it helpful when I was coming out. Seeing those stories and those films, they pretend to make me more depressed or more closed off. And so I wanted to see one where, it was a really healthy depiction of how that can conclude that relationship.
Yeah, I agree. And it's really nice to see, I guess, almost like a blueprint of how one should respond when, someone is being very vulnerable and honest and open about something they feel nervous about, whether that's a bag, ostomy bag, or whether that's how they identify, etc. So
I think the actor Adam does that really well. I was just rewatching it before the interview, and he just does this amazing sort of shift in his whole body language, where you can see he's like, okay, he's thinking about it. How do I respond to this? And then everything just kind of relaxes in him, and it's like he kind of reaches like, okay, well, it doesn't really matter. I just have to be here with you. Like I just have to show up, kind of thing. And the rest will sort itself out.
Meet you where you are.
Yeah.
How did you find the actors too? So they're Nikolai Lafayette and Adam Solis.
Yeah, they were incredible. So again, student filmmaker, I don't have a huge background at directing actors, so that was the point of that year, and it was a fantastic year of workshopping and learning techniques of working with actors. But they certainly had a lot more experience as actors than I had as a director. Part of the challenge of the course, I guess, was that we didn't really get to do a proper audition process, which was just mostly because of resources. So we were able to work with like a casting agent where we could send them a profile of this is what the character is, and then we could look at like an online directory and find actors and see their show reels and kind of pick a short list and then send them, look, this is who I'd love. But you didn't know until the day of filming what actors were going to show up, so we didn't get to do any rehearsal. So the first time I met Adam was him arriving, for the makeup room that morning. Nikolai, I cheated a little bit because he had come to a workshop earlier in the year at Afters, and he got assigned to me when we were workshopping an early version of the script, and he was just so fantastic. And I felt like, okay, well, we've already done an hour of work with you, so let's like capitalize on that. So when it came time to casting him, I just put his name number one. I was like, can I please have Nikolai? And thankfully he was free and said yes. But the two of them hadn't even met each other as well.
Wow, their chemistry is so strong.
It was incredible. And they were just so generous. They, for something that I think some actors could be really uncomfortable with, the content, the subject matter, they really came again open-handed, and they taught me a lot. They were really respectful, really open to notes and dialogue. And they, even though they hadn't met each other before, I was so impressed with how well they were able to develop that chemistry. We didn't have a lot of time for rehearsal. I think we had like an hour for rehearsal and makeup. So the whole film, if you watch the film, we made the whole film in a day, I think between like 9 and 4 p.m. It was like a crazy amount of shots to get through, which we also had to have like a 45-minute lunch break in the middle, and that had to include makeup. And mine, of course, was the only film that involved some sort of like additional prosthetics. We had to fit the bag and do a prosthetic scar. And so I realized, look, the only way we're going to be able to do this is if we can do the rehearsal during makeup. And so when we did the makeup, I got them to do some connection activities where it's sort of like a film school one they teach you, where you do like a 20 first dates questionnaire between each other, so you develop sort of some intimacy really quickly. And then the next thing I was like, look, I'm just going to be brave here, because I feel like it's going to be really important that we have some sort of physical connection before we get out onto the stage floor. And it got to the point where the makeup artist was about to start putting the bag on Nikolai, and I was like, well, I'll just see what happens. So I just said to Adam, I was like, hey, do you by any chance want to put it on? And I think Adam could see exactly what I was doing, but again, he was like really open and, prepared to give it a go. And so he was like, okay. And so that meant that the first time that ever really sort of touched each other, beyond probably a handshake, was then, being physical in that space around the abdomen and making that connection. The other thing I did with the ostomy bag was I had filled it with like flour gel, which is like this like silica gel with water in it, which gave it like a very disgustingly accurate weight and consistency. And I remember when Nikolai, the moment he put it on, like straight away he was like, oh, whoa, this is really weird kind of thing. And it was fantastic too, because it gave it straight away this authenticity where I could see for the first like hour, he was constantly like rearranging his pants and like making sure it wasn't falling off and like this feels weird. I was like, yeah, exactly. That's it. Like that's exactly what it's like all the time when you have one. So that worked really well.
That's fantastic. I feel like that really came through to like the connection between them, as well as how uncomfortable he felt in his body. So that's so brilliant. It's really nice to hear how you sort of achieved that in the background.
Yeah, they were amazing. 5 stars.
Awesome. So it did get selected for a lot of film festivals. I interpreted that as winning awards. And I'm sorry because I maybe misinterpreted that incorrectly. But yeah, share with me, did you end up going to any of the film festivals that it was selected for?
The local ones. So I was able to do like Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. And then the first international ones, I had my ticket to London. And it was going to play in the BFI Theatre at South Bank. And then,
thanks COVID.
Thanks COVID. So cancelled the flight. And then I think the BFI, then they were like the day before the screening day, because at first was like, oh no, the festival's still going ahead. And the day before mine was meant to screen, they then cancelled the festival. They did, I think, then put the whole thing online a couple of weeks later when they'd sort of figured out how to do that. So that was a bit disappointing, but it was weird because it then also then proceeded to do a lot of festivals across America and sort of Europe. And in fact, people at that point were kind of, I don't know if it worked in my favor because everyone was looking for something to watch from home. And so there was a lot of then festivals that did whole streaming festivals, film festivals. And so I got to do, some Q&A panels for festivals over Zoom that I probably wouldn't have done because I wouldn't have been able to fly to wherever to do that. So, in some ways it might have given the film some more exposure. Yes, unfortunately we didn't win any official awards, but we got a lot of what they call official selections, which is when like the jury panel sort of picked the film for the festival. So I was pretty happy with that. It was like, it's my second film. I made a very dodgy film in my undergrad, but we we won't talk about that. The undergrad film doesn't count. I was very happy that it got the number of film festivals, and then the fact that ABC then picked it up for Ivy, I was really happy with that too.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It was also featured on Film Inc., which is a pretty popular publication as well.
Short film of the week for them.
Which is brilliant. I really love this audience feedback, which I found on YouTube. Sorry, I did a bit of stalking for the April 2020 LGBT Wild Sound Film Festival. And they had you probably know this better than me, a video of everyone giving their feedback on Boldly Go. And someone said, and I think this nails it, one of the most important, succinct pieces of transformative media or cinema that I've seen in quite a while. And I absolutely mean that because representation fucking matters. I just think that really nailed it because, I agree wholeheartedly. Particularly with, obviously, we harp on a lot about disability in film, but it's really hard to find, apart from some of the more ones that people are more aware of, it's really hard to find good representation of disability in film that isn't just like a joke or a throwaway thing. Yeah.
And there's a bigger discussion there, I think, around just how accessible the industry is to work in the industry, which I think contributes to that. So even just in, my own experience, I find it very hard. The nature of the film industry in Australia, and certainly seems to be the same in America, it's a very, very crazy work hustle culture. It's very common people to do 12-hour, 14-hour shoot days, have 6-7 hours off and come straight back to set and then proceed to do that for 6 weeks. And so I couldn't do that. I'd be in hospital after week 2. And so unfortunately the nature of that infrastructure, that whole studio system and the way that that's financed means that it has a lot of gatekeeping. I think we're starting to see the shift, particularly I think in Australia through Screen Australia and the state funding bodies, where they're allocating funding for diverse voices and access needs, which is fantastic. But until we start to see more of that, it's always, I think, going to be limiting how many stories we see on screen.
Yeah, definitely.
From minorities or, with disabilities.
Particularly when it's always a better film when it's created by someone with that lived experience. And if those people with lived experience can't get through the door to actually make the film, then we're not going to see as many of those depictions.
100%. You can always tell when it's a film written by, like, where the topic was not written by a person from that demographic or minority. So authenticity is, I think, really important.
Yeah, and I think people want to see that as well. Audiences are usually smart enough to know when that this is a bit bullshit, I think.
Yeah. And like, I don't know if you've seen the new Heartbreak High on Netflix.
Yes, we covered it on the podcast.
Oh yes, okay. Well, I mean, I look at that and think, yes, like there is a future here. That's where we need to
100%.
Yeah, that model of filmmaking.
Yeah. Also, the SBS show Latecomers is great.
I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, it's definitely worth watching. It's really good representation, and hopefully that opens the door to a lot more. So on that note, let's talk about some depictions of IBD and ostomies in film and TV. Actually, before I go through them, I wanted to mention one thing because I think it's pretty paralleled, not film or TV thing, but have you heard of the musician Perfume Genius?
Oh yeah, love Perfume Genius.
Yeah. So I did not know this, and I've listened to his albums many times, but he has Crohn's. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he has used it in his music quite a lot, discussed it a lot in interviews as well, and a lot of his lyrics are references to his life with Crohn's. And there's a few articles which I'll link where he talks about it, particularly during the pandemic lockdowns where he was quite unwell, and it sort of prevented him from being able to commit to the album that he was working on, which he eventually did release. But yeah, I just thought that was really interesting, particularly as a queer person as well.
Yeah.
Because his lyrics are also very much referencing to being a queer person as well. So I just thought that was interesting because he's a musician that I love, and it's like,
yeah. Oh, I'm going to have to go and read all that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, so now I just want to listen to all his albums and pick the references. Just thought I'd mention that because he's not in the film or TV industry, but obviously very established musician. But in terms of film and TV, is there any particular references that you've seen to Crohn's in movies and shows that you'd like to talk about?
There's not a lot. Like, I've got to be honest, I haven't seen a great deal out there. Usually, if there is a reference, it's a joke. It's like sort of a punchline. And sometimes they're fantastic. I mean, I've got to say, there's been a few of those where I have laughed so hard just because the fact that it's been mentioned and then that it was a joke as well. The ones that come to mind, there's the show The Thick of It, which is Armando Iannucci, who's the creator of Veep. It's his first show. And
I haven't seen it, but I love Veep.
Yeah, it's a fantastic show. Very dark satire, sort of government bureaucratic satire. And there's a fantastic scene where this new director comes into this department and he's sort of, try to tighten everything and make everything more efficient. And he's kind of whinging at one point to the office secretary about a staff member he's seen go to the bathroom for like the 10th time today, and they're just clearly slacking off. And then it's just the secretary just so coldly shuts him down, where she goes something like, well, that's Kevin and he has Crohn's disease. It just comes completely out of the blue, and then he's sort of like startled and shocked where it's like, oh, okay, I don't want to get cancelled, and sort of kind of moves on. But it was, again, just even though it was just mentioned, for me, I was like, oh, that was fantastic. And there was another one I saw recently in Nora from Queens. Awkwafina is Nora from Queens.
Oh yeah, I haven't seen that either.
In the second season, she's working at a CBD shop, and there's a customer that comes in who has Crohn's, and again it's sort of just the punchline of the joke, really. She's very pale, very emaciated, and mentions that she has Crohn's, and then Nora just proceeds to just talk over the top of her about like her pooping habits, and it is quite funny, but perhaps not the best depiction in terms of agency or breaking down any stigma. Yeah, but I
Yeah.
must confess, I still laughed, but I have a dark sense of humor.
And do you think, because I feel like it's still okay to laugh at those jokes. And I think sometimes I'm accused of like trying to cancel a show because I don't like a representation. But I think it's okay to engage with it and enjoy it as long as we acknowledge that, oh, this is a bit off color, or, you know, that's not the best
Yeah,
representation.
yeah. Just be critically aware of what you're watching, and
Yeah,
don't just take it, spoon fed. Yeah.
definitely. I actually looked up ostomy bag on IMDb and the results were just terrible. Like there was no, you know, there was like joke references and films where I was like, was there an ostomy bag in that one, etc. But there was two films that did come up which I haven't seen but I thought might be worth mentioning. White Boy Rick. It's a Netflix film from 2018 starring Matthew McConaughey, and it's based on a true story of a drug dealer, Rick, who is also an informant for the FBI. And in real life, that actual Rick was shot by a drug lord, which severely damaged his large intestine and led to him having an ostomy. So, like in that depiction of what happened, the main character, I don't think it's Matthew McConaughey, I think it's a younger man, does wear a pouch, and you actually see it on screen and see him emptying his pouch. And the screenwriter did say that they wanted to show some vulnerability, sympathy, and empathy that the character deserved by depicting the ostomy in that way. And the United Ostomy Association of America's Joy Hooper was quite happy about that film and said that she appreciated that depiction of displaying life with an ostomy and was able to show a negative aspect of life respectfully. So that's positive, I guess. I haven't seen it, so I can't really say much more than that. Have you seen White Boy Rick?
No.
Obviously, it's not a depiction of IBD itself, but obviously an injury that led to having a pouch. But it sounds like they wanted to depict that to create empathy for the character rather than to create some sort of awareness.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe I'll watch that one day. I'm not sure. It doesn't look that exciting otherwise. But one depiction I thought sounded a bit not great. Again, not a person who has IBD, but in He Was a Quiet Man, starring Christian Slater. I haven't seen it. Have you seen it?
No.
A character, Vanessa, is shot during an assassination and becomes paraplegic with a colostomy bag. She's a love interest of the main character. And then in a moment where she's singing a karaoke song, her colostomy bag falls to the floor and grosses out her audience. So I feel like, haven't seen it, can't really comment, but it sounds like it's used more as a shock device rather than anything helpful or useful.
And interesting that they're both gunshot wounds.
Yeah.
I think that perhaps there's probably a lot of, like, if there is a representation of an ostomy, it tends to be like a cup or something like that, like it's a bullet wound.
Exactly.
Which I guess is mostly just probably because of Hollywood, because it's America. Like, we don't get shot in Australia that frequently. So it's more likely the cause of an ostomy here is, IBD or, bowel cancer. But because it's the States, maybe that's why they're all bullet injuries.
And it feels like it's used in a depiction, and this is only two examples, and there's not many others, to sort of represent that injury and how bad the injury was. This poor person has to have a bag, rather than trying to normalize it, I guess.
Yeah.
So more for narrative Hollywood shock value than anything else.
Yeah.
Because it's not as fun to depict someone with Crohn's with a bag.
Yes. And I guess it's interesting to think about in terms of how one of those unusual things with the ostomy bag in terms of, okay, well, how do we portray this on screen, where it's like, okay, you want to normalize it, but you also don't want to be seen that you're just using it as a plot device to create conflict or gross out the audience and create disgust. And so I think that's interesting. Like when you talk about that first example where it showed him empty the bag, you could film that in so many different ways, just in terms of your coverage, to be more sympathetic of the person and their emotional journey. Or is this just like a Hollywood gaze where it's just to show something really gross and close up of feces or whatever? And so even just the choices you make as a director sometimes can really change the perception of a scene.
Like I probably should have watched like the clip. It'd be interesting to see what kind of music underlies that scene. Like, is it really like eerie music or is it like casual music? I think that would make the difference. If we're supposed to be like disgusted or just intrigued or whatever. Is there anything that you've seen involving colostomy bags, especially leading up to making Boldigo?
The only one I remember seeing that actually where I saw an ostomy bag on screen before making the film was in Sense8 in the first season. I think it's like episode 2 or something. It's early on. Again, it's a cop, and it's like a scene in a bar, and he's like fighting with his son. And it's again sort of a bit like a throwaway joke where he throws his ostomy bag on the table in the pub, kind of thing, as like a stuff you to the son, and like and laughs, kind of deliberately to gross him out.
Yeah.
All I remember thinking at the time when I saw that, because I had an ostomy at that point in time, was like, they're not plug and play. Like, it's not that simple to do that without one, like, making a gigantic mess and, stinking out the entire pub. I just remember thinking, like, oh, if only it were that easy. If only it were that simple. Yeah.
Probably wasn't written by someone who's had an ostomy bag.
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
Oh, one thing I came across as well, which actually got me thinking about this episode, is I was reading about Alien, and I read that Crohn's was apparently the inspiration from the writer Dan O'Bannon, who had Crohn's disease. And after experiencing all the symptoms and distress from Crohn's, he felt like, and this is a quote, the digestion process felt like something bubbling inside of him, struggling to get out, which gave him the idea of one of the most iconic scenes from Alien, where the alien punches its way out of John Hurt's chest in that dinner scene. I thought that was interesting because apparently he was quite secretive about his Crohn's disease, the writer. And, when we think about Alien, like, we think about that scene. So I don't know, what have you, I'm assuming you have?
Oh yeah, I love Alien. I only just saw this story the other night, and I think it's amazing. I'm so excited by that anecdote, because even though he was secretive about it, and it, obviously was on a campaign of awareness about the illness or the condition or anything, I was also fascinated that it's like, oh, isn't that amazing that you've taken something that, again, can be a real struggle, and you've used it as inspiration, not only to make art, but one of the most iconic film scenes in cinema history.
Yeah.
And so someone with Crohn's, I was like, oh, I'm taking that. That's mine. Yeah, I'm going to be on that team. That really made me excited reading that, because it's exactly what it feels like when you've got extreme abdominal Crohn's pains. It's like, yeah, that's what it feels like. There's an alien trying to, and I've probably made that joke at times of, like, I feel like there's an alien trying to burst out of my belly. And I'll never look at Alien the same now whenever I watch that scene. Yeah.
I think that also speaks to how iconic Alien is too, because I know, as a woman who's gone through childbirth, I think often people will see that scene not knowing that sort of backstory as a metaphor for childbirth, and how violent it is, and how it feels having an alien inside your body. So it's nice knowing, and I hopefully more people know. Hopefully it gets out more and more. It sounds like people are more aware of it now, that's where that came from, and transforming his struggles with IBD into something so creative and far-reaching.
I also just like the idea too. It's like, okay, cool. So you're saying I can have Crohn's and make an award-winning script that will be lived on forever in Hollywood? Sure, cool, good to know. It's achievable.
Yes. So I guess to wind up in this arena, we both watched The King of Staten Island, which was one of the things that did come up of, like, Crohn's being a big part of it. So King of Staten Island is a 2022 film directed by Judd Apatow, written by Pete Davidson and Judd Apatow and Dave Cyrus, which is loosely autobiographical. First of all, what did you think of King of Staten Island?
I enjoyed it. Yeah. So I rewatched it for the second time. I think I saw it when it came out, and I watched it again last night. I like Pete Davidson's, like, comedic performance abilities. I think he manages to balance, like, the bit like Robin Williams, I think, in some ways. Like, he can do really big, bold comedy, but then also then do really sort of vulnerable human drama, which is a rare thing in an actor. So I think I always enjoy watching him on screen. And there's like an element of unpredictability always when you're watching him. You don't know what he's going to do next, just even in a sentence with his face or with his body. So I think I found that always fascinating with him. And then the story itself, I thought, was pretty good, pretty feel-good, rom-com-y vibes. Yeah.
I have to admit, I haven't really paid attention to Pete Davidson until he started dating Kim Kardashian. I don't know. I think because I haven't watched a lot of the later Saturday Night Live, which is sort of where he broke out. I kind of missed him, but he's very clever and very funny.
Mm.
Yeah, so the film is very similar to his life in that I guess it's about a young man who must get his life together after his mum starts dating a new man. His mother, played by Marissa Tomei, who's very good.
Yeah.
And the new man that she starts dating is Bill Burr, another comedian I haven't really engaged with, who, like Pete Davidson's the character and himself, like his deceased father, is a firefighter. So the character in King of Staten Island, who's played by Pete, is an aspiring tattoo artist who smokes a lot of weed and has a casual relationship with his childhood friend. So Pete Davidson said this was kind of the film. What would have happened if he hadn't become a comedian? And in real life, Pete's father was a New York City firefighter who actually died in service during the September 11, 2001 attacks, which really affected him. Pete was 7 when he died and attributes that death to a lot of his experiences growing up, where he said he quote unquote acted out, but also had some pretty significant mental health issues, including suicidal ideation. So I think as a mental health perspective, it's really amazing that he's been very vulnerable with sharing that on screen. But he also was diagnosed with Crohn's in real life at age 17 or 18, which is also mentioned in the film. I thought there would be more about Crohn's, but there's really just a couple of lines. But I thought they were good lines. What did you
Me
think?
too. Yeah. I think, like I said, when it's something that doesn't get spoken about very often in films, just any line you kind of grab at, you're like, oh, yay. They said Crohn's. And again, that authenticity, the fact that like he himself has Crohn's and he's the performer and the co-writer, was great to see. I think it happens about 3 times from memory. There's sort of 3 references.
Yeah.
The first one is early on. He's fighting with his mum because she starts dating Bill Burr and he's not happy about that. And he's kind of like, complaining, why are you doing this to me? Like, my life's hard enough as it is, between dad dying, and I've got Crohn's. And that's sort of about it, sort of thing. But it's the second scene, I think, that's probably the most some sort of representation, I guess, where that he's at a ballpark with Bill Burr. He's, Bill Burr's trying to get to know him better, and Bill Burr's there with all his other firemen, sort of co-workers, and they're watching a baseball game,
including Steve Buscemi.
Oh yes, who's
for some
great.
reason.
And I think Steve Buscemi is the one who asked him, "Do you want a hot dog?" And then he goes, "Oh no, I can't. I've got Crohn's." And then he goes, "Oh, what's that?" And then he says, "Oh, it's where like the lining of my gut's all messed up, and so I just need to shit all the time." I think something like that.
Yeah.
And then Bill Burr says, "Next time, just say you don't like hot dogs." And I thought that was great, actually. I laughed a lot at that moment.
Yeah. And his response is like, "I'm just trying to raise awareness," which I thought was great.
That was when I laughed, yeah. And he's saying it kind of like flippantly. It's sort of, sort of very on the nose. I'm just trying to raise awareness.
I feel like that is the conversation I would have with boomers if I had Crohn's. It would be, or, having mental illness or whatever, it'd be like, I'm just trying to raise it. Like, leave me alone. I can say it if I want.
Yeah.
It felt like a very natural conversation.
It was great. It was great too, because it also highlighted, like we talked about earlier, one of the things that is awkward is doing group eating activities.
Yeah.
And so it captured that quite succinctly, I thought. And that balancing act where you're always, I think particularly I felt with Crohn's, where it's like, how much information do you give away? Because it's like you have to provide some for explanation and context, but you also don't want to gross people out. And it's also one of those things too where it's just the nature of it. It's not something you generally want to talk about while eating. And yet eating is the time you're prompted to talk about it. So
exactly.
It's this weird like contradiction that happens. Yeah. So you sort of feel like there's no way to win here. And I thought it captured that very well, that scene.
Yeah. And the response that you often get from people who don't feel comfortable about that, like, just don't mention it. And their immediate response of being like, no, that's too much information, when it's common knowledge that everyone has a system that gives waste. Related to that, you don't often see him eat. Well, you don't really see him eat in the film at all from memory. But one thing that he does engage a lot with is marijuana, which apparently Pete Davidson has used medical marijuana for a lot of his life, although he has reduced some of the use of it over time. And he, has also engaged in other recreational drugs, which he's had some struggles with as well. But he does attribute his ability to work and to function with medical marijuana. And if he didn't, that's the only thing that's really helped him to eat and manage his pain. So it's good to hear. Obviously, this is more in interviews rather than in the film. They don't really mention it, why he smokes weed a lot, but it's good to hear some positive representation of self-management in that way, if that works for you.
Yeah, I think I read one of the interviews where he said somewhere that he couldn't even go on stage for SNL usually because of the abdominal pain from Crohn's, unless he had had medical marijuana or CBD. And I just thought that was really, interesting and fascinating too. That just kind of gave you an insight into the severity of the condition, and it also kind of highlights, I think, that thing of that we just never really know the struggles necessarily that people are going through, the nature of invisible illnesses. That on the surface, it's very easy to see Pete Davidson and just be like, "Oh, you're like a celebrity, international celebrity on TV. Your life can't be that hard." And yet, it's like, okay, well, there's this thing that's literally, preventing you from doing the thing you're famous at
Yeah.
constantly, and you have to manage that.
Yeah, and especially with media really playing up a lot of drug use in celebrities as well. Because before I knew anything about Pete Davidson, like I'd heard a bit about he's been admitted to rehab a few times. He's actually been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which he gets treatment for, and PTSD. And, that's also great to hear some of that representation too, is that, he's not just, the media likes to beat up people who engage with drugs as being like the crazy guy. And, he's having problems and he's sort of seen that light as being, and just a drug addict or whatever. And I think it'd be nice to have a little less stigma about any drugs, but also the fact that it's okay, that he uses weed to help him, and that shouldn't be like a stigma.
And great that he's been so vocal about it, I think, in interviews as well. Yeah, sharing that awareness. Because I think I remember there was something in the gossip stuff recently where someone on Twitter had, like, a famous comedian had made a joke about, how sunken and how pale he was and like his sort of raccoon eyes, whatever. And it was one of his girlfriends that like replied on Twitter being like, "You realize he has an autoimmune disease?" Like, these remarks that people can make sometimes offhandedly without thinking about the reality of that circumstance.
Yeah, and how harmful that is. Not just, Pete Davidson doesn't care, but your friend with Crohn's disease might care.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and apparently in his stand-up, he mentions Crohn's, like he uses it for stand-up material as well, which, as you say about, like, comedians in general, it's a nice way to channel your struggles into an art form. I haven't seen any of it, but now I will probably. Is there anything else you wanted to say about King of Staten Island? Because there's not a lot of Crohn's content in it, but in terms of representation, I felt like it was pretty good.
Yeah, I've got to say it's probably the best I've seen in terms of like something mainstream that, one, it references it, tick. Two, it's actually authentic. He has Crohn's and he's the one who's the storyteller, tick. And three, there was some attempt to kind of, look at the subtext there of what that's like to live with in terms of just societal complications that happen day to day around eating and misunderstandings with other people. Yeah, so.
And in a way, I think it's good to see it not as a plot point as well as just, I have Crohn's. Because we don't see a lot of that in films unless it's like, this is the movie about this person has this thing, like eating disorders or whatever. And
it's very normalized.
Yeah, it's very normalized, and people can feel seen in it without it being like too on the nose in the face. I guess in terms of that, and knowing that we've got one little bit of one film, what would you prefer to see from more depictions of Crohn's and more appropriate representation?
It's interesting because I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where it's the nature of the condition it is a challenging one, I think, for any sort of screen depiction, where it's such a fine line that you're walking between, are you trying to raise awareness and normalize condition, or are you now exploiting this for storytelling or for conflict purposes, or shock and awe to the audience. So it's interesting. I've thought about future films that I might make, and some people ask me would I ever look at adapting Bold to Go into a feature, and I've kind of struggled to think about, okay, well, how do you do that in the sense of no one wants to just watch a film where someone's just going to the toilet all the time, and so it's sort of, you want to give visibility to the illness and awareness about it, but there's also not necessarily a need to be hyper focused on elements, I guess, and so that probably just comes down to authenticity, I feel like people who have that lived experience are going to make those judgments better.
Mm,
Uh,
mm.
they're going to know what's sensitive and what's appropriate, and probably have a better understanding of, you know, what it is that they would like to see on screen
Yeah.
anyway.
What do you think in navigating that? Is there anything you can see yourself doing to ensure that you're representing it in a way that's authentic but also entertaining, but also not too exploitative? Though I'm sure you probably wouldn't do that.
Well, I think for me, it would be about focusing more on the individual and like their emotional state and
Mm,
like psychologically, I guess, the journey that they're going through. That you can reference things in the physical world, but you don't necessarily need to focus on that with
yeah.
the lens or with the editing. The more compelling narrative is, I think, the journey that you have to go on as an
Mm,
individual of internal growth or learning to balance, you know, chronic illness in day-to-day life, learning how to navigate relationships with something that also is going to be taxing on your, you know, emotional and psychological wellness. I think that's probably the better point to come at it from. It's
mm.
focusing on emotionally the storytelling aspect of it rather than the physicality, I would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. And I feel like you did that really well in Boldly Go in that we see the bag, but it's not like the central piece. Like,
Yes.
yeah, it's done in that sort of way where it's really about the emotions rather than the bag
Yeah.
itself. Yeah.
The internal conflicts. Yeah.
Yeah. If you were to give anyone advice about anyone making films in this space or wanting to make a film about chronic illness, what would your advice be?
I'd probably go back to that review that representation effing matters.
Yes.
So if you're going to do it and you don't have a chronic illness, then go and get people who do have chronic illnesses and bring them in. And,
Mm,
you know, that whole nothing about us without us. So
mm,
find people who have lived experience and talk to them and listen to their stories, and then go about crafting that into your story. I think that would probably be my main take. And if you're someone who has a chronic illness and you're interested in telling that story, just go and do it. There's no real rules. If you're telling your story, you can do it your way. So
mm.
filmmaking's never been more accessible, I think, than it is today. You can
Yeah.
literally, you can make an award-winning film on your mobile phone. You can shoot it, edit it, submit it. It's kind of just up to you having the decision and the you know, ability to go out there and make it yourself. So
Yes, agreed. And lastly, what advice would you give to anyone recently diagnosed with Crohn's or about to have a colostomy bag fitted?
mm,
Big
probably two
question,
different things.
sorry.
Yeah, they're good questions, but two different things.
Yes.
If you've just recently been diagnosed with Crohn's, most people who are diagnosed with Crohn's are young. The sort of is in late teens is the most common period, late teens, early 20s. If I think back about when I was diagnosed with Crohn's, things that I would probably want to hear: one, that, okay, this is scary, but it's not going to define you. Like, you
Mm,
can still live a version of a good life. It will be challenging, yes, but it's not going to mean that you can't do things that you want to do. You just might have to do them differently and
mm,
change some of your strategies, but you can still achieve your goals
mm,
in some way. I'd say also seek out support networks that are going to help you. So
mm,
that's, you know, friends and family that you trust, that you know are going to look out for you. But then also, you know, various medical support networks. So Crohns and Colitis Australia is a
mm.
fantastic organization. They've got a great website with a whole lot of information on it. Um, be really careful about what you study online would be my other advice, having gone through it as well. That,
Mm,
like a lot of medical conditions, the temptation is just to go to Google and type it in. There's a lot of horror stories out
mm,
there, a lot of misinformation. It's very easy to lose perspective
mm,
and to just get really scared. I've got to say this. I remember Googling things and then reading stories and just being like, oh my gosh, is this going to happen to me?
mm,
And so just, you know, one anecdote from one person out of, you know, the entire global population does not represent your life. And in fact,
mm.
I tend to feel it's the people who have unfortunately had the most challenging stories or, you know, the most medical trauma are the ones who are probably most likely to then talk about it online.
Yeah, which makes sense
And
as well. Yeah.
it makes sense. It makes
Mm.
sense, but it does also give you a weird confirmation bias where you feel
Yeah.
like, oh, everyone with Crohn's is going to end up like this. Whereas, you know, when I think about my younger brother, who, you know, yes, Crohn's has been a challenge for him, but he's never had to have any surgeries to date, and he's, you know, only 2 years younger than me. You know, he's probably not as likely to jump on a Crohn's message board and
Mm,
write about
mm.
that.
Yeah.
And that's actually a lot of people. So yeah, that would be my other advice. Just take everything you read online with a grain of salt.
Definitely. Yeah.
And I guess the last thing would be you're allowed to be picky with your medical team if you can. I mean, in Australia, we're very lucky. Maybe not so much, in America, but whoever is your gastroenterologist, it's going to be like most likely some sort of long-term relationship with them managing your condition. So I think it's really important that you find someone that you can work with, that you feel like is listening to you, that you're present and seen with, and that you're getting from them what you need. And if you're feeling like that's not happening right at the start, that's not a great sign.
Yeah.
So you can go back to your GP and ask for a referral to another gastroenterologist. If you're in a capital city, there's going to be a couple to choose from, and that's okay. Like, you're allowed to do that. Would be my other advice.
I guess part of that is also being able to advocate for yourself. And if that's difficult, which it can often be, having that support network to help advocate for you as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, that's where sort of Crohns and Colitis Australia as well, and support groups can help you. In terms of what you might tell someone who's about to have an ostomy, that can be for any number of conditions and all sorts of ages and stages of life. Medically, I would say get in touch with the stoma nurses. That most of the hospitals who do those procedures will have a dedicated stoma nurse, whose job is there for patient support and education. And they're really, that's their job. They're very skilled at it, and they will have an abundance of resources to be able to help you with. The next thing I would say is, if you're about to have one, yes, it is a change to your life, but again, you will be surprised that you'll still be able to do so many things that you think right now you won't be able to do. I remember thinking, like, I'm not going to be able to go swimming. Yes, I was able to go swimming. There's so many things that you will still be able to do. It will be difficult for the first few weeks while you're just physically healing. But once that is sort of out of the way, you can live pretty much a regular day-to-day life.
Which I feel is reflected in Bald Ego too, is that, the character's at a party, he's drinking, he's hopefully going to get some later. He's
exactly
able to do all the things.
Yeah, there's also like accessories you can get that can make life so much easier. One that he references in the film, where he says, I normally have a belt, but it's in the wash. You can get these they're kind of like made out of wetsuit material that are like kind of like what people have for like hernia support, like a strap that goes around your abdomen, and it just holds the bag and everything in place. And so if you're planning on doing exercising or swimming, it's fantastic because you just have so much more peace of mind, and it almost feels like it's not there. So if you can get one of them, they're great. You can get all sorts of funky covers people make on Etsy if you want one that's got like dinosaurs on it, or
cool.
Platypuses. Add some style to your bag. Why not? And then I think the last thing I would say is that it's also quite common when you start out that everyone's bodies are shaped differently, and so it's impossible to make a single product that's going to fit for everyone. And there's like a huge range of products out there, different systems, like one-piece systems, two-piece systems, different kinds of adhesive, different base plates, and part of that initial journey is just like shopping for shoes, like just finding the right device that fits for you. And it's not uncommon, like I talked about that story of me going the first couple of days and having a leak. That's quite common at the start because you're still trying to figure out, one, how to even apply it yourself, but then two, like, is this the right piece for me? And so don't think just because those first few weeks it's like, oh, it's leaking all the time, this is what my life is going to be. It's not. It's just bumpy at the start while you kind of iron out the kinks. And then generally after that it's fairly smooth sailing. And I found in my case I was healthier with the bag, and that's you hear that a lot too. Generally, if you need to have an ostomy bag, then you tend to be better for having it. It's
worth
a better quality
the
of
discomfort.
life.
Thank you so much for that. I hope lots of people hear this podcast episode and hear that advice, because it's really amazing advice, and I feel like people really appreciate having some guidance in the space when it's, can be quite scary at first as well. Thank you.
No worries.
So before I let you go, is there anything you'd like to plug? Obviously your film, how can we see it besides ABC Iview, and your social media contacts if you're happy for people to follow you?
So for the film, it's an Australia exclusive, so it's only on ABC Iview. However, if you are outside of Australia and you search for the film, there may or may not be several pirated copies already floating around on various streaming sites. So I'm always, there's nothing I can do about that. Sorry,
I mean,
ABC.
that just means you've made it, that you're
So
being pirated.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it can be found. Just go back a few more tabs on Google and you'll find it. As for socials, yeah, if you're interested in my film and what I might be up to next, probably the best thing you can do is follow me on Instagram. My handle, it's just CJC_films. And you can also check out my website, which is just my name, ChristopherCosgrove.com.
Awesome. And have you got anything that you're working on at the moment or in the future?
I have just started working on some scripts again. I think, like a lot of people, after COVID was sort of a bit discombobulated and refinding my feet, and I had been a bit unwell again with Crohn's, and so now that that's sort of stabilizing again, I'm back in that okay, let's get writing. So I'm playing around with a couple of short film script ideas at the moment, and I want to have a go at writing a pitch and a pilot for a TV series. Based on a kid's book that I really loved as a kid, but kind of in a sort of like a Stranger Things sort of space.
Awesome. So. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on to Psychocinematic and talking to us. It was such an interesting and wonderful chat, and I really appreciate your time.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
This podcast is not designed to be therapeutic, prescriptive, or constitute a formal diagnosis for any listener. For a longer version of this disclaimer, please check the episode notes on your podcast app.